Family, friends, and co-workers huddled tonight outside a restaurant to remember murdered Fort Valley State senior Anita Gunn. They released 23 balloons, one to mark each year of her life.
Valentine's Day 2020. While most college students were celebrating love, 23-year-old Anita Gunn was planning her future. The Fort Valley State University senior had job interviews lined up, graduation approaching, and dreams bigger than her small Georgia town. But at 8:30 a.m., something went terribly wrong. Her best friend Sierra woke up to bizarre messages from Anita's phone. Messages that didn't sound like her at all. Messages about meeting up with some mysterious dude she'd never mentioned before. A black Toyota Corolla with red pinstripes began circling her friend's neighborhood. Her phone went silent. Her car disappeared. By the time her father raced down from Atlanta, a massive search was underway. Helicopters, ground teams, a task force determined to find the promising young woman who'd simply vanished. What they discovered would reveal how quickly love can turn into something deadly. Fort Valley, Georgia, 2020. At 23, Anita Gunn embodied everything a college senior should be: focused, ambitious, and ready to conquer the world. The agriculture major at Fort Valley State University had found her passion in a field that promised to feed communities and change lives. Between her demanding coursework and shifts as a server at 1836 Restaurant and Lounge, Anita maintained the kind of schedule that impressed professors and made her father Christopher proud. Life hadn't always been easy for the Gunn family. After losing her mother as a child, Anita and her younger brother had been raised by their father in Atlanta. The loss had bonded them tightly, and Christopher's regular check-ins from Atlanta weren't just parental concern. They were lifelines connecting a family that refused to let tragedy define them. Anita's move to Fort Valley in 2016 had been about more than education. It represented independence, growth, and the chance to build something meaningful in agriculture. Her professors knew her as the student who asked thoughtful questions. Her co-workers at the restaurant knew her as the server who never missed a shift. Her friends knew her as the girl who could light up any room with genuine warmth. But there was a part of Anita's life that didn't match the success story everyone admired. Hidden beneath her academic achievements and social confidence was a relationship that had been slowly poisoning her happiness for months. DeMarcus Little seemed perfect on paper. At 22, the U.S. Army sergeant had his own tragic backstory, losing his mother young, just like Anita. He'd grown up in Fort Valley before joining the military in 2016, eventually landing at Fort Eisenhower as a unit supply specialist. His family adored him. His military record was spotless. His progression to sergeant in just 3 years spoke to dedication and competence. When Anita and DeMarcus first connected, their shared experiences of loss created an immediate bond. Here were two young people who understood grief, who had overcome childhood trauma, who were building successful futures despite early hardships. Friends saw them as a perfect match, the ambitious college student and the decorated soldier, both rising above difficult beginnings. But perfect relationships don't cycle through constant breakups and reconciliations. Healthy partnerships don't require friends to take sides or witness dramatic scenes. Normal couples don't create anxiety in their social circles about when the next explosion will occur. Anita's friends had started noticing patterns that troubled them. The relationship was described as on again, off again, but the volatility went deeper than typical college romance drama. There were periods of intense connection followed by sudden separations. There were arguments that seemed disproportionate to their causes. There were reconciliations that felt more like surrenders than genuine solutions. Sierra Stewart, Anita's best friend, had watched these cycles with growing concern. She wasn't a fan of DeMarcus, describing him as trouble, and their relationship as unstable. But Anita kept returning to him, drawn by something her friends couldn't understand or compete with. The military connection gave DeMarcus an aura of stability and protection that masked what was really happening behind closed doors. His uniform represented service and honor, making it difficult for outsiders to recognize the control and manipulation occurring in private moments. 2 weeks before Valentine's Day 2020, that private toxicity would explode into public violence that should have served as the final warning everyone needed. The text messages between Anitra and DeMarcus told a story that would later chill everyone who read them. What began as typical romantic communication had devolved into something far more sinister, a documented trail of psychological warfare that revealed the true nature of their relationship. In her own words, preserved forever in digital evidence, Anitra described DeMarcus as an evil, manipulative person. This wasn't casual frustration or the heat-of-the-moment anger that happens in normal relationships. This was a young woman recognizing something fundamentally wrong with the person claiming to love her. "I'm tired of your threats and abuse," Anitra wrote in messages that would later be read aloud in a court. The threats weren't empty or occasional. They were constant enough that she felt compelled to document her exhaustion with them. The abuse wasn't physical at first, but psychological manipulation designed to control her every decision and relationship. DeMarcus had perfected the art of emotional terrorism. When Anitra tried to distance herself or assert independence, he would escalate to his most powerful weapon: suicide threats. In November, after she attempted to end all communication, DeMarcus claimed he was going to kill himself and blamed her for pushing him to that point. The manipulation was calculated and cruel. After threatening suicide, DeMarcus would go silent for hours, leaving Anitra frantic with worry about his welfare. She would reach out repeatedly, concerned that someone she once cared about might actually harm himself because of their relationship problems. When he finally responded, DeMarcus told her that his attempt on his life did not work, but his manipulative tactics had worked perfectly. Within days, their communication was re-established, and Anitra was back under his psychological control. This cycle revealed how abusers exploit their victims' compassion and empathy. Anitra couldn't completely disconnect from someone threatening self-harm. Even when she recognized his manipulation, her caring nature became the very weapon he used to maintain access to her life. But DeMarcus's threats extended far beyond suicide. He had become obsessively focused on other men in Anitra's life, real or imagined. His accusations of infidelity were constant and paranoid. He monitored her social interactions, demanded explanations for casual friendships, and turned every male contact into evidence of betrayal. On Anitra's birthday in November, even though they had broken up, DeMarcus told her he was sparing the man he believed she was going out with that night. The implication was clear. He had considered violence against someone whose only crime was spending time with his ex-girlfriend. The threats became increasingly specific and dangerous. DeMarcus sent Anitra a screenshot of a message offering someone $200 to harm her alleged date. He told her they were going to have problems if she went out with this person, adding "on my mama" to emphasize his seriousness. Most chilling of all were his direct threats against Anitra herself. "His mercy has limits," she would later tell others, describing how DeMarcus had made it clear that his restraint in harming her was temporary and conditional on her compliance. The psychological pattern was textbook domestic abuse escalation, control through accusations, manipulation through suicide threats, isolation through threats against other relationships, and ultimately, direct threats of violence when other tactics failed to maintain dominance. Anitra understood she was trapped in something toxic, but breaking free from psychological manipulation is infinitely more complex than simply walking away. Each attempt to establish boundaries was met with escalating threats. Each effort to maintain other relationships was punished with accusations and intimidation. On November 1st, Anitra made a clear attempt to break the cycle. She wrote that they should stop speaking to each other altogether. She told DeMarcus that every time they talked, she ended up being manipulated. This moment of clarity represented her recognition that their communication itself had become a weapon against her. But DeMarcus wasn't going to let her escape that easily. When words and threats failed to bring her back under his control, he escalated to the next level of violence. 2 weeks before Valentine's Day, at 3 a.m. on February 5th, DeMarcus would prove that his threats weren't empty promises, but previews of the terror to come. The sound of shattering glass would mark the moment when psychological abuse crossed into physical destruction, and signal that Anitra's life was in immediate danger. February 5th brought violence that should have ended everything between them. At 3 a.m., Anitra and her friend Scoot were jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. Someone had slashed the tires on Anitra's car and hurled bricks through 2 windows of her house. When DeMarcus eventually admitted responsibility for this attack, it represented a clear escalation from psychological terror to physical destruction. Yet somehow, just 8 days later, Anitra was back in his orbit. February 13th began like any other night for a college senior, a house party with girlfriends, laughter, and the temporary escape that comes with being young and carefree. Anitra attended with a couple of friends, including Tracy King, enjoying what should have been a normal social evening in Fort Valley. Around 11 p.m., she made a decision that would prove fatal. Instead of going home alone or staying with her girlfriends, Anitra left the party with DeMarcus and his friend Javon Abram. The choice seemed innocent enough, reconnecting with someone she had history with, perhaps believing that their recent troubles could be resolved. This decision illustrates one of the most dangerous aspects of abusive relationships: the false calm that often precedes explosive violence. Abusers become skilled at creating moments of normalcy that make their victims question whether the previous abuse was really that serious. They apologize convincingly, promise change, and create enough doubt that victims begin to minimize their own experiences. The group traveled to DeMarcus's home first, spending several hours together in what appeared to be peaceful reconciliation. Past 2 a.m., Javon drove Anitra and DeMarcus to her house on West Church Street so she could retrieve her car. The logistics were practical and routine. Anitra needed her vehicle for the next day's job interview. After collecting her car, the couple went to Waffle House, one of those late-night destinations that marks the end of an evening out. The normalcy of this activity, sharing a meal, talking, behaving like any other couple, masked the undercurrent of tension that had been building for months. From Waffle House, they drove to the house on Chestnut Hill Road, where DeMarcus's aunt lived. This location would become crucial to understanding the timeline of what happened next. The aunt would later confirm to police that both Anitra and DeMarcus had spent the night there, providing the last independent verification of Anitra being alive. The evening had unfolded with an eerie calmness that contradicted everything that had come before. No dramatic arguments, no obvious signs of distress, no indication that anyone was in immediate danger. Anitra had voluntarily spent hours with DeMarcus, suggesting either that she believed their problems were resolved or that she underestimated the threat he posed. February 14th dawned with routine expectations. Anitra had a job interview scheduled for 9:30 a.m., another step toward building the successful future she had been working toward. According to DeMarcus, she left the aunt's house around 11:30 a.m., telling him she was heading to that interview. If his timeline was accurate, Anitra would have been 2 hours late for her appointment. If his story was true, she had left for an interview she had already missed. If his version of events was honest, she had walked out of that house under her own power, heading toward her car and her future. But Anitra Gunn never made it to that job interview. She never made it to her restaurant shift. She never made it home to her house on West Church Street. Somewhere between leaving the aunt's house on Chestnut Hill Road and disappearing forever, Anitra encountered something that would end her life and shatter her family's world. The calm of February 13th had been an illusion, a final peaceful moment before a storm that would destroy everything Anitra had worked to build. By evening on Valentine's Day, her father would be racing from Atlanta, a task force would be forming, and the question that would haunt everyone would be simple. What happened to Anitra Gunn? Valentine's Day, morning 2020. Sierra Stewart woke up late to find several messages waiting on her phone from her best friend Anitra. The conversation started sweetly enough. Happy Valentine's Day. Greetings between friends who genuinely cared about each other. But then the messages took a bizarre turn that would haunt Sierra forever. The text claimed Anitra was looking to hook up with someone she just called dude. This phrasing immediately struck Sierra as wrong. Anitra didn't talk like that. She didn't use casual terms like dude for potential romantic interests. Most importantly, Sierra knew Anitra was only involved with one person, DeMarcus Little, despite their complicated on-again, off-again dynamic. Sierra tried to be supportive, responding as any good friend would when someone mentions meeting someone new. But something felt fundamentally off about the entire conversation. The word choices, the timing, the sudden shift in Anitra's apparent romantic interests. None of it aligned with the person Sierra knew intimately. Across town, David Scoot Howard was having his own unsettling experience with messages from Anitra's phone. The 21-year-old barber lived just a few doors down from Anitra on West Church Street, close enough that he could see her front door from his driveway. They had hung out a couple of times, but were barely friends, just neighbors getting to know each other. Scoot had realized he might have left his work phone at Anitra's house the previous night and messaged to ask if she could look for it. The response he received was completely bizarre. Instead of a simple yes or no about the phone, the person texting claimed they needed his address and would drive over to him. This made no sense to Scoot. Anitra knew exactly where he lived. She could practically see his house from her front door. Why would she need to drive anywhere? Why was she asking for an address she already knew? When Scoot tried calling Anitra directly, she didn't answer. The text responses claimed she just couldn't talk at the moment. Then came something even more confusing. Messages that seemed to be trying to break up with him romantically. Scoot was baffled. They weren't dating. They barely knew each other. Why was someone using Anitra's phone to end a relationship that didn't exist? The person with Anitra's phone persisted in asking for his address. Growing suspicious and uncomfortable, Scoot responded that he wanted no part in whatever was happening. But instead of ending the conversation, the messages became more insistent about meeting up. Standing outside his house, Scoot watched in growing alarm as a 2019 black Toyota Corolla with red pinstripes began circling his block 5 times, maybe 6. The car would drive by slowly, then circle back, then drive by again, as if the driver was surveying the area or looking for something specific. The connection between the strange messages and the circling car was impossible to ignore. Someone was using Anitra's phone to gather information, while simultaneously conducting surveillance of the neighborhood. This wasn't random or coincidental. It was coordinated and deliberate. Scoot quickly noted the license plate number and reached out to Sierra Stewart. Both friends were now receiving bizarre communications from Anitra's phone, and neither could reach her directly. The messages they were getting didn't sound like their friend, didn't match her personality, and seemed designed to gather information rather than maintain genuine friendships. Then, abruptly, all communication from Anitra's phone stopped. The silence was more frightening than the strange messages had been. When someone's communication pattern shifts dramatically and then stops entirely, it often signals that their ability to control their own phone has been eliminated. The person who had been sending those bizarre texts was no longer able or willing to maintain the charade. Messages from concerned family and friends began flowing to Anitra's phone throughout the afternoon and evening. "Where are you? Are you okay? Please call me back." But no responses came. The phone that had been actively sending strange messages all morning had gone completely quiet. Sierra's growing panic was shared by everyone who knew Anitra's reliable communication habits. This wasn't someone who disappeared without explanation or ignored worried family members. Anitra was responsible, predictable, and deeply connected to the people who cared about her. The license plate number Scoot had recorded would later prove crucial to his investigators. That black Toyota Corolla with red pinstripes wasn't just randomly circling the neighborhood. It belonged to someone with a very specific interest in controlling the narrative around Anitra's disappearance. By evening, when Christopher Gunn received Sierra's frantic call about his daughter's strange behavior and sudden silence, the terrifying truth was becoming clear. Someone else had been using Anitra's phone all morning, and Anitra Gunn was nowhere to be found. Christopher Gunn didn't hesitate when Sierra Stewart's frantic call reached him in Atlanta. His daughter's strange behavior and sudden silence triggered every parental instinct he possessed. Within hours, he was driving toward Fort Valley, his mind racing through possibilities while hoping for reasonable explanations that never came. Before leaving Atlanta, Christopher made a crucial request. He asked Fort Valley police to conduct a welfare check at Anitra's house on West Church Street. When officers arrived, they found an empty home and no sign of Anitra anywhere. Most concerning of all, her 2013 white Chevy Cruze was missing along with her. By the time Christopher arrived in Fort Valley to formally file a missing persons report, law enforcement had already recognized the seriousness of the situation. This wasn't a college student sleeping off a party or taking an impromptu trip. This was a responsible young woman whose disappearance contradicted everything her family and friends knew about her character. A task force formed immediately, bringing together Fort Valley police, Peach County Sheriff's Office, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. The coordination between multiple agencies signaled that authorities understood they were likely dealing with something far more serious than a simple missing person case. The investigation quickly centered on one location, the house on Chestnut Hill Road, where DeMarcus's aunt lived. This was Anitra's last confirmed location, and DeMarcus was the last person known to have seen her alive. The aunt confirmed both had spent the night there, but only DeMarcus had been seen leaving. Media attention followed quickly, with news crews arriving to document the search efforts and broadcast appeals for information. Sheriff's deputies spoke directly to cameras. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Volunteers, tips, and community support poured in. DeMarcus Little found himself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight as the primary person of interest. To media and public alike, the mathematics was simple. He was the last person to see Anitra. Their relationship had been troubled, and now she was missing. The scrutiny was intense and immediate, but DeMarcus handled the attention with calculated responses designed to deflect suspicion while maintaining public sympathy. When questioned by reporters, he presented himself as a concerned ex-boyfriend cooperating fully with authorities. He claimed ignorance about Anitra's whereabouts and expressed hope for her safe return. Behind the scenes, however, his behavior was raising red flags with investigators. Rather than becoming increasingly frantic and cooperative, as most innocent parties do when someone they care about disappears, DeMarcus became more guarded and less forthcoming. After initial questioning, he stopped answering questions and obtained legal representation. This response pattern is common among perpetrators who want to appear helpful while actually limiting their exposure to investigation. Genuine concern typically increases over time, while calculated deception requires careful management to avoid inconsistencies. The search efforts were massive and methodical. Georgia State Patrol helicopters flew grid patterns over wooded areas surrounding Fort Valley. Ground teams combed through dense woodland, checking hiking trails, abandoned buildings, and remote locations where someone might dispose of evidence. Volunteers joined organized searches, covering hundreds of miles of terrain in their determination to find Anitra. 3 days into the search, on February 17th, investigators made a discovery that would shift their investigation into an entirely new phase. Anitra's 2013 white Chevy Cruze was located just a few blocks from her house on West Church Street. The car's condition told a disturbing story. The front bumper was missing entirely. Mud and debris clung to the tires, suggesting the vehicle had been driven through rough terrain. Inside, investigators found her wallet and keys, but notably absent was her cell phone. Most damning of all, forensic examination revealed DeMarcus's fingerprints and palm prints inside the vehicles and on the trunk, evidence that he had been in and around Anitra's car after she disappeared. The discovery transformed the missing person case into something much more sinister. The damaged car, the missing bumper, the forensic evidence, all suggested that whatever had happened to Anitra had involved violence, transportation, and concealment. The hunt for a missing college student was about to become a search for a murder victim. On a rain-soaked day when aircraft couldn't fly, a Peach County Sheriff's deputy was patrolling back roads when something caught his attention. Off the main roadway, he spotted what appeared to be a path leading into the trees, a path that looked like it had been recently disturbed by a vehicle. The deputy parked his patrol car and decided to investigate on foot. As he walked deeper into the wooded area, more evidence of recent vehicle activity became apparent. Trees showed fresh damage from something large brushing against them. Vegetation was crushed and broken in patterns consistent with a car being driven where cars weren't meant to go. About 150 yards off the roadway, under a thin covering of tree limbs and brush, the deputy made the discovery that everyone had been dreading. The body of a young woman lay poorly concealed among the trees. Even in the decomposed state, it was clear this was what remained of Anita Gunn. Near the body, investigators found the missing piece of the puzzle that connected everything together, part of the front bumper from a 2013 white Chevy Cruze, the same bumper that had been missing from Anitra's car when it was discovered abandoned in Fort Valley. The autopsy results would reveal the brutal reality of Anitra's final moments. She had been strangled, a deeply personal form of murder that requires sustained physical contact and intent. There were also indications she had been struck at least once in the head, suggesting a violent struggle before her death. Most heartbreaking of all, the medical examiner determined that Anitra's body had been dragged into the position where she was found. Even in death, she had been handled like an object to be disposed of, rather than a human being who had deserved love and respect. The discovery of Anitra's body transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a homicide. But it also revealed something darker about the psychology behind her murder. The strangulation method, the remote disposal location, the attempt at concealment, all suggested someone who had killed in a rage and then tried methodically to cover their tracks. Domestic violence homicides often follow this pattern when abusers finally lose complete control over their victims. The escalation from psychological manipulation to property destruction to physical violence culminates in murder when the abuser realizes their victim is truly trying to escape their influence. Anitra's attempts to break free from DeMarcus throughout their relationship had triggered increasingly violent responses. The slashed tires and broken windows 2 weeks earlier had been warning shots. The strange text messages on Valentine's Day morning had been attempts to control the narrative after the murder had already occurred. The evidence was overwhelming. DeMarcus's fingerprints in and on Anitra's car, his cell phone location data, placing him in areas consistent with disposing of evidence. His possession of Anitra's phone long enough to send those bizarre messages to her friends. His lies about where the car was located when he helped with the search. But rather than immediately charging DeMarcus with murder, authorities made a strategic decision that would build their case systematically. On February 19th, just days after Anitra's body was discovered, DeMarcus Little was arrested, but not for the crime everyone knew he had committed. Instead, he was charged with the property damage incident from February 5th. The slashed tires and broken windows that had preceded Anitra's murder by 2 weeks became the legal mechanism for getting DeMarcus into custody while investigators built their homicide case. The arrest strategy served multiple purposes. It removed a dangerous individual from the community while preserving the integrity of the murder investigation. It allowed authorities to gather additional evidence through search warrants and forensic examination. Most importantly, it prevented DeMarcus from potentially fleeing or destroying remaining evidence. When DeMarcus appeared in court for the property damage charges, his family maintained his innocence and expressed confidence in his character. His stepmother told media that her son had never been violent, never been in a fight, never had any criminal background. She described him as a good kid, a good soldier serving our country. The disconnect between public perception and private reality is common in domestic violence cases. Abusers often maintain exemplary public personas while terrorizing their intimate partners behind closed doors. DeMarcus's military service and clean record made it difficult for some people to believe he was capable of murder. But the evidence didn't lie. The forensics didn't lie. And soon someone very close to DeMarcus would reveal that his claims of innocence were nothing more than calculated deception. DeMarcus was offered a $10,000 bond for the property damage charges, with release conditions including an ankle monitor. His family prepared to post bail, believing they were helping an innocent young man wrongly suspected of a terrible crime. But just hours before DeMarcus could be released from the county jail, authorities made their next move. The property damage charges had served their purpose. Now it was time for murder charges, and DeMarcus wouldn't be facing them alone. Law enforcement made their decisive move. He was charged with malice murder, and he wasn't alone. His longtime friend Javon Abram, the person he had described as like a brother, was arrested alongside him on charges of giving false statements and concealing a death. The joint arrest revealed that investigators had uncovered something far more complex than a simple murder case. They had discovered how killers manipulate their closest relationships to cover up their crimes, turning friends into unwitting accomplices through deception and emotional manipulation. Javon Abram had been DeMarcus's closest friend, the person who had picked him up on Valentine's Day morning and helped him navigate the aftermath of Anitra's disappearance. But what Javon initially thought was helping a friend in crisis had actually been participating in covering up murder. The transformation from loyal friend to key witness began on Sunday, February 16th, just 2 days after Anitra's murder. Javon and DeMarcus left church together and went for a drive, a routine activity that would become the moment when everything changed between them. During that car ride, DeMarcus made a decision that would ultimately seal his fate. Perhaps overwhelmed by guilt, or maybe needing to share the burden of what he had done, DeMarcus confessed everything to his closest friend. According to Javon's later testimony, DeMarcus described pouring his heart out to Anitra the night before, telling her they were soulmates and expressing how much he loved her. But instead of the response he wanted, she had laughed at him. That rejection had triggered something violent and unstoppable. "I don't know what happened. I blacked out," DeMarcus told Javon, describing how he had grabbed Anitra and started choking her. He said she fought at first, but then it looked like she just gave up because she wanted to be with her mother, referring to Anitra's deceased mother. The confession revealed the psychology behind intimate partner homicide. The murder hadn't been premeditated or calculated. It had been an explosion of rage triggered by rejection and humiliation. When Anitra laughed at his declaration of love, DeMarcus couldn't handle the loss of control and dominance that represented. But the confession didn't end with the murder. DeMarcus described to Javon how he had methodically disposed of Anitra's body, placing her in the trunk of her own car and driving out toward Crawford County. The rough terrain had caused the front bumper to fall off, which he later retrieved and asked Javon to help dispose of. This revelation devastated Javon, who realized that his assistance the previous day, helping to move car parts, providing transportation, following DeMarcus's directions, had made him an accomplice to murder. He had been manipulated into participating in a cover-up without understanding what he was really doing. The psychological manipulation extended beyond the immediate aftermath. DeMarcus had used their friendship, their shared history, and Javon's loyalty to secure help with evidence disposal. When Javon had pointed out Anitra's abandoned car with the missing bumper, DeMarcus had brushed off his observations, claiming it couldn't possibly be hers. Javon's testimony would later reveal the systematic nature of DeMarcus's deception. On Valentine's Day morning, when DeMarcus called for a ride from near where Anitra's car was found, he told Javon that his own vehicle had broken down. The request seemed innocent enough. Friends help friends with transportation problems. But cell phone location data would prove that DeMarcus had been lying about everything. His phone showed him traveling from the aunt's house on Chestnut Hill Road to the remote location where Anitra's body was found, then back to Fort Valley, where he abandoned her car before calling Javon for pickup. The technology that tracks modern life had created an unshakable timeline that contradicted every story DeMarcus had told. His phone had accompanied him to dispose of Anitra's body, had been with him when he dumped evidence, and had recorded his movements as he tried to cover up his crime. When confronted with this evidence, Javon made the agonizing decision to tell the truth. The person he had considered a brother had used their friendship to make him complicit in murder. The loyalty he had shown had been exploited to help conceal one of the most serious crimes possible. Javon's cooperation with investigators demonstrated how even close relationships can be weaponized by those who commit domestic violence. Abusers don't just manipulate their victims, they manipulate entire social networks to enable their behavior and help cover up their crimes. The cell phone data that corroborated Javon's new testimony was devastating to DeMarcus's defense. Every location, every movement, every timeline detail supported the account of someone who had committed murder and systematically tried to hide the evidence. When DeMarcus Little's trial began in March 2022 at the Peach County Courthouse, it was his former best friend who served as the prosecution's star witness. The person he had confessed to, the person he had manipulated into helping him, the person he had considered family. Javon Abram would be the one to ensure justice for Anitra Gunn. The brother who had broken under the weight of truth was about to break the case wide open. March 2022. The Peach County Courthouse became the stage where 2 years of investigation, evidence gathering, and heartbreak would finally seek resolution. DeMarcus Little sat in the defendant's chair, facing charges that could result in life in prison for the murder of Anitra Gunn. Defense attorney Benjamin Davis painted his client as an upstanding soldier incapable of such violence, a humble man serving his country, who didn't fit the profile of a killer. But prosecutor Neil Halverson had a different story to tell, one supported by months of text messages that revealed the true nature of DeMarcus and Anitra's relationship. The courtroom fell silent as prosecutors read aloud the digital evidence that chronicled a relationship's descent from love into terror. Anitra's own words described DeMarcus as evil and manipulative. Her texts documented being tired of threats and abuse and feeling manipulated every time they communicated. The suicide threats, the accusations of infidelity, the direct death threats, all were preserved in electronic evidence that painted a devastating picture of psychological warfare. When Anita had written in November that they should stop speaking because every time we talk, I end up being manipulated, she had recognized the toxic cycle consuming her life. But perhaps the most chilling evidence came from Javon Abrams' testimony about DeMarcus's confession. Speaking directly to the jury, Javon described how his former best friend had admitted to strangling Anita after she laughed at his declaration of love. The murder hadn't been planned. It had been an explosive reaction to rejection and loss of control. The cell phone location data provided unshakable corroboration for Javon's account. DeMarcus's phone had traveled from the aunt's house to the remote location where Anita's body was found, then back to Fort Valley, where her car was abandoned. Every movement, every timeline detail supported the prosecution's case. When DeMarcus took the stand in his own defense, his testimony created more problems than solutions. Under cross-examination, prosecutor Don Basin systematically destroyed his credibility by comparing his statements to the cell phone evidence. DeMarcus's responses became increasingly desperate as the evidence contradicted every explanation he offered. His claim that the cell phone data was inaccurate for certain time periods while being perfectly accurate for others defied logic and believability. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. On the charge of malice murder, they found DeMarcus Little not guilty, but on the charge of felony murder, the verdict was guilty. They had concluded that while DeMarcus may not have planned to kill Anita, his actions had directly caused her death. The distinction mattered less than the outcome. Both charges carried the possibility of life imprisonment, and the judge imposed the sentence that prosecutors had requested: life without the possibility of parole. Assistant District Attorney Don Basin spoke publicly about the challenges of prosecuting domestic violence cases, particularly the tendency of some people to blame victims for returning to abusive relationships. He compared the process to a frog in a pot of slowly boiling water. Victims don't recognize the escalating danger because the changes happen gradually. The sentence of life without parole reflected the court's recognition that domestic violence murder represents one of society's most serious crimes. DeMarcus Little, the decorated soldier who had seemed perfect on paper, would spend the rest of his natural life in prison for destroying the promising young woman who had trusted him with her heart. Anita Gunn's legacy extends far beyond the tragic circumstances of her death. She was a dedicated student who had found her passion in agriculture, a field that could feed communities and change lives. She was a reliable employee who never missed shifts at the restaurant where she worked. She was a loving daughter who maintained close ties with her father despite the geographic distance between them. Her murder serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence can hide behind military honors, successful careers, and public respectability. The warning signs that friends and family witnessed, the on-again, off-again relationship pattern, the escalating threats, the property destruction, were clear indicators of escalating danger that required immediate intervention. Justice was served in DeMarcus Little's conviction, but the real victory would be preventing similar tragedies through increased awareness of domestic violence, warning signs, and more effective intervention strategies. Anita Gunn deserved to graduate from college, build her career in agriculture, and live the bright future she had been working toward. Her memory honors every effort to recognize danger before it becomes deadly.